She fired him at 7:14 p.m. By 7:22 p.m., she was on her knees with a gun pressed to her temple, and the only person standing between her and a body bag was the man she'd just thrown away like a piece of trash. If you've ever dismissed someone because they were too calm, too quiet, too humble, watch this story all the way to the end. Drop a like and comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been threatening all evening, the kind of slow, pressurized buildup that sits heavy in the air before it finally breaks. Celeste Ashford noticed it the way she noticed most things, clinically, briefly, then not at all. She had more important things to occupy her mind than weather. She always did. The Ashford Group's annual investor review had wrapped 40 minutes behind schedule, which was 40 minutes Celeste would never get back, and the thought of that lost time chewed at her as she descended in the private elevator from the 42nd floor of her own building. The elevator was marble-floored and mirrored on 3 sides, which meant there was no avoiding herself. 30 years old, tailored charcoal blazer, hair pinned back so severely it could have been architectural. People sometimes described her as beautiful. Celeste found the observation irrelevant. What mattered was what she built, what she controlled, what she could point to and say, "I did that." Her phone was already in her hand before the elevator doors parted. 3 missed calls from her CFO, a string of texts from her VP of operations, a calendar notification reminding her of a 6:30 breakfast meeting that she absolutely could not be late for. She was composing a reply before she even crossed the lobby, heels clicking across imported Italian stone like a metronome. Nolan Hayes was already outside. He always was. The black Mercedes S-Class sat idling at the curb, engine barely audible, and Nolan stood beside the rear door in his dark uniform jacket, hands clasped in front of him, watching the street with the quiet attention of someone who never fully stopped paying attention. Celeste had noticed that about him in the early weeks, the way his eyes moved. Slow, methodical, sweeping. She'd initially chalked it up to professionalism. Later, she'd decided it was something closer to blankness. The man had no opinions, no apparent ambitions, no fire. He just was. "The Westmore, Mr. Hayes," she said without looking up from her phone. "I need to be there before 8. "Yes, ma'am." He opened the door. She got in. She didn't say thank you. She never did. Not because she was deliberately rude. She simply didn't think about it. Nolan closed the door with the same careful precision he always used, neither too hard nor too soft, walked around to the driver's side, and pulled smoothly into evening traffic. For the first 6 minutes, the ride was exactly as it always was. Celeste reading, tapping, answering messages, and Nolan invisible behind the wheel in the way that good service people become invisible when they're doing their jobs well. The city bled past the tinted windows, office towers going dark floor by floor as the workday ended, cabs jockeying for position at stoplights. A street musician on the corner of 7th and Main, saxophone case open at his feet, playing something slow and bluesy that got swallowed by the rain-heavy air before it could travel. Then Nolan made a turn she hadn't authorized. He took a right onto Calloway Street instead of continuing down the main artery toward the Westmore, and even though Celeste was mid-sentence in a text message to her CFO, she felt it. The deviation. Her internal compass for routes was as precise as everything else about her. "This isn't the usual route." Not a question. "No, ma'am. There's a collision at the Driscoll overpass. Looks bad. I'm routing through Callaway and picking up Marchetti Boulevard on the other side. Should cost us about 3 minutes, but save us closer to 12. "I didn't ask for an alternate route." A brief pause. "No. You asked to be at the Westmore before 8. We wouldn't make it on the usual route." Celeste looked up from her phone for the first time. Nolan's eyes found hers briefly in the rear-view mirror, then returned to the road. His expression was what it always was. Composed, neutral, present without being aggressive about it. "I decide the route, Mr. Hayes, not you." "Understood." "Turn around. Take the usual way." Another pause, shorter this time. "The overpass is going to be gridlocked. The accident looks significant. I could see emergency flashers from 3 blocks out. We'll be late." "Then we'll be late." He didn't argue. He found the next available U-turn, brought the car back around, and pointed it in the original direction. Celeste returned to her phone, but something was still moving in her chest. Not quite anger, Not quite frustration, but the particular kind of low-grade irritation that comes from feeling that someone doesn't fully understand what their role is. Or worse, understands it, but thinks they know better. They hit the gridlock exactly where Nolan had said they would. The overpass was a mess. 2 vehicles crumpled against the median divider, 3 police cruisers, an ambulance, a fire truck, and the resulting backup stretching back nearly half a mile. They sat completely motionless for 4.5 minutes before traffic inched forward a single car length. Celeste didn't say anything. She stared at her phone, but her jaw was tight and her thumb was moving faster than necessary across the screen. "I told you," she said at last, quietly. "Yes, ma'am. I told you and you argued with me. I offered you information. You made the decision. You argued." Nolan's hands stayed on the wheel, 10 and 2, exactly where they were supposed to be. "I explained what I was observing. I should have deferred immediately. I apologize." It was a clean, professional apology. Appropriate. Mature. Most people would have received it, accepted it, moved on. But Celeste had been sitting in the back of a car she paid for, in traffic she'd predicted, running late to a meeting she couldn't be late to, and something about the whole sequence of it, the deviation, the explanation, the correct prediction, and now the measured apology. Something about all of it had gotten under her skin in a way she couldn't entirely explain and didn't particularly try to. She thought about what her mentor had told her once, back when she was 24 and still clawing her way into boardrooms where no one wanted her. The people around you either make you faster or they slow you down. There's no middle ground. The second you sense someone is slowing you down, cut them loose before the slowness becomes permanent. She'd applied that principle with ruthless consistency. 4 executive assistants in 5 years, 2 marketing directors, 3 PR firms. She didn't apologize for it because the results spoke for themselves. The Ashford Group had grown from a $12 million startup to a nearly $3 billion operation in 7 years. And that didn't happen by being sentimental about personnel. "Pull over when you can," she said. "Ma'am? Find a place to pull over." Nolan did. A bus stop cutout, recently vacated, just past the worst of the congestion. He brought the car to a stop, shifted into park, and turned in his seat with the composed attention she'd come to recognize as his default mode. He wasn't nervous. He never looked nervous. That too somehow annoyed her in this moment. "I've been thinking about this for a few weeks," she said, which wasn't entirely true. She'd been thinking about it for approximately the last 8 minutes. "And I've decided we're not the right fit." A beat. "Excuse me?" "I need someone who acts, not someone who questions. Someone who understands that their job is execution, not consultation. You're talented at the technical side. Punctuality, navigation, vehicle maintenance, all fine. But the culture I'm building requires a different kind of confidence." Nolan looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not hurt exactly. More like a man making a precise internal calculation. "Is this about the route?" "It's about a pattern. I've been your driver for 11 months. I've never been late. I've never had an incident. I'm not disputing any of that. Driven you in weather conditions that 3 other services turned down. I've rerouted around 2 protests and a gas main break, both times at your explicit instruction. Mr. Hayes." Her voice was level, not cruel. "I'm not filing a grievance. I'm informing you of a decision. You'll receive full severance per your contract, a positive reference for any future employer, and transportation home tonight arranged through our HR department." She met his eyes. "I appreciate your service." The phrase landed the way those formal phrases always do, like a door being closed very politely. Nolan held her gaze for another second. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, removed his corporate identification badge, the laminated card with the Ashford Group logo, and his name printed under a photo that made him look slightly more severe than he actually was, and placed it carefully on the center console. "All right," he said. That was it. No appeal, no anger. No, "Do you know who I am?" or "You'll regret this," or any of the other things people usually said when they got fired. He just set the badge down with the same quiet precision he'd used to close her car door for 11 months, and that was that. He was out of the vehicle and on the sidewalk in less than 30 seconds, backpack over one shoulder. He always kept a backpack in the trunk. She'd noticed it before without caring why. and something else in his right hand. A picture frame, small, no larger than a paperback book. She glimpsed it briefly through the window. A kid, maybe 6 or 7 years old, grinning in a red baseball cap. Then Nolan turned, and the picture turned with him, and she lost sight of it. She watched him for a moment longer than she intended to. Watched the way he walked, unhurried, steady. A man who carried his own weight without making it visible. And then she looked away, pulled her phone out, and called dispatch for a replacement vehicle. The rain finally broke as she was waiting. Real rain, the kind that had been building all evening, thick and cold and immediate, slicking the pavement in seconds and drumming against the Mercedes roof with something approaching urgency. Celeste watched the street through the water-blurred glass and told herself the low feeling in her chest was just the traffic delay. 3 blocks away, Nolan Hayes walked in the rain. He didn't walk fast, and he didn't walk slow. He walked the way he walked everywhere, methodical, each step placed with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had spent years moving through terrain where the cost of carelessness could be permanent. The rain didn't seem to bother him particularly. He'd been rained on in worse places. He'd been rained on in places where rain was the least of what was falling. The backpack on his shoulder held the items he'd kept in the Ashford Group's vehicle facility locker. A change of clothes, a phone charger, a small first aid kit that most people would have considered excessive for a driver's locker, but that Nolan considered minimally adequate, and a novel he'd been reading in the same fragmented 15-minute increments for the past 3 months. The picture frame, Dylan, 6 years and 4 months, red cap from a Mariners game, caught mid-laugh at something Nolan had said that he couldn't even remember anymore. He carried in his hand rather than packing it. He thought about the drive. He thought about the moment he'd seen the emergency flashers on the overpass and made the call without asking, the way he'd always made calls without asking in every context he'd ever been in, because in every prior context that was exactly what had been required. It had taken him a long time to recalibrate to civilian life, to understand that the instinct to act, to assess and move without checking a chain of command, was not universally valued outside of the situations that had formed it. He thought about Celeste Ashford's face when she'd said a different kind of confidence. He almost smiled at that, but not quite. His phone buzzed. He shifted the picture frame to his left hand and pulled the phone with his right. "Hey, Dad. Grandma says dinner's at 6:30, but she's already putting the noodles in, so I think it might be earlier. Did you get the traffic? I saw it on the news." Dylan, always watching the news because Nolan had made the mistake, when the boy was 5, of explaining that watching the news was how you stayed informed about the world, and Dylan had taken that to heart with a thoroughness that was occasionally inconvenient. Nolan typed back, "On my way. Maybe a little late tonight. Save me some noodles." A pause. Then 3 dots. Then, "I saved you some last time and you ate them cold at midnight and said that was fine, but I could tell it wasn't." Nolan actually smiled at that one. A real smile. Not a performed one. The kind that starts in the eyes and moves downward and is mostly private. He typed, "I'll be there for the actual dinner this time. Promise." He pocketed his phone and kept walking. He was passing the east side of the Ashford Group's corporate headquarters, a black glass tower that took up most of the block. Lobby visible through the ground floor windows, still busy with the tail end of the workday departure, when he heard the sound. It was not a scream, exactly. It was the kind of collective sound that a group of people make in the moment just before screaming, a sudden compressed intake, half gasp and half silence, the sound of a room full of people processing something that hasn't finished happening yet. Nolan stopped walking. He turned toward the building. Through the lobby windows, 40 feet away, rain-blurred but not obscured, he saw 3 men moving, not walking, moving. The specific kind of purposeful, rapid movement that people who've trained for entry make. The low center of gravity, the way they held their hands. 2 of them had weapons visible, and the third had something in his right hand that Nolan's brain identified and categorized in under a second. A 4th figure, lobby security, was already down. Nolan stood on the wet sidewalk in his driver's uniform, with a picture frame in his hand and a backpack on his shoulder, and for one genuine second, he didn't move. He thought about Dylan. He thought about the conversation they'd had 2 years ago. The specific one, sitting in the kitchen of his mother's house on a Tuesday night when Dylan had asked him why he didn't do the soldier stuff anymore, and Nolan had tried to explain, fumbling, inelegant, not entirely honest, that he decided to come home and be a father instead, that some people in the world spent their whole lives heading toward danger, and some people eventually chose to come back from it, and that coming back was its own kind of choice that deserved to be honored. Dylan had nodded with the careful attention of a 6-year-old receiving information he doesn't fully understand but has decided to take seriously. Then he'd asked if he could have another brownie. That conversation was real. That choice was real. The quiet domestic life Nolan had been building with careful patience for 2 years. The routines, the school runs, the noodle dinners, the accumulation of ordinary moments he'd missed while serving. That was all real. And inside that lobby, the security guard on the floor hadn't chosen to be on the floor. The employees dropping behind reception desks and copy machines hadn't chosen this Tuesday evening for their worst day. And somewhere behind him, in a car she was waiting to be replaced, Celeste Ashford was 3 minutes away from being escorted back into a lobby that was currently occupied by men who had clearly done extensive reconnaissance on her building. Nolan set the picture frame against the base of a parking meter. He would come back for it. He shrugged the backpack off his shoulder, unzipped the front pocket, removed the items he'd need, and repacked it in 4 seconds. Then he straightened up, assessed the lobby layout through the glass one more time. Entry points, sight lines, the angle of the security desk, the distance between the 3 visible operatives, and moved toward the building. There was a side entrance on the Callaway Street face of the building. Staff access. He knew the code from 11 months of parking in the Ashford Group facility, and codes like that didn't change often because the people who set them were always more confident in their security cameras than their security protocols. He punched in the number. The light went green. Nolan Hayes opened the door and went back to work. What? The lobby of the Ashford Group's headquarters was, on any normal evening, the kind of space designed to make people feel small in a way that felt prestigious. 40-foot ceilings, a waterfall feature along the north wall that nobody ever really looked at, a reception desk carved from a single piece of black granite that had reportedly cost more than some of the support staff's annual salaries combined, a detail that circulated through the building in the way uncomfortable truths always do, quietly and repeatedly. On this particular evening, the waterfall was still running. Everything else had stopped. There were 14 people visible in the lobby from Nolan's position in the service corridor. 11 employees flattened against walls or crouched behind furniture. One reception manager named Sandra, who he recognized from 11 months of daily pickups, and who was pressed behind her own granite desk with her hands over her mouth. One lobby security officer named Paul, who was face down and motionless on the marble floor to the right of the main entrance, and one masked operative standing approximately 12 feet from Sandra with a weapon leveled in her general direction. Nolan counted 2 more operatives in his peripheral sweep, one covering the elevator bank, one positioned near the main entrance, visible through the gap in the service corridor door. A 4th had been visible from outside and was currently out of his sightline, which meant either he was holding a position Nolan hadn't mapped yet, or he'd moved to a secondary location. He cataloged this information in the approximately 2 seconds it took him to confirm his entry angle and check that the corridor behind him was clear. His breathing was even. His hands were steady. This was not bravery exactly. It was the absence of the particular kind of fear that comes from unfamiliarity. Nolan had been in rooms like this before. Not this room, not this building, not these specific people, but rooms where the math was this simple. Someone with a plan meets someone without one, and the person without a plan generally loses. He had a plan. It had taken him about 11 seconds to form it. The first thing he did was find the electrical panel. Every building this size had a junction panel in the service corridor, and the Ashford Group's was exactly where he'd expected it. Gray metal box on the east wall, labeled in the way that made perfect sense to the electrician who'd done it and very little sense to anyone else. He didn't need it to make sense. He needed it to give him 4 seconds of darkness in a specific section of the lobby, which was 4 seconds more than the operatives inside would know what to do with. He found the right breaker. He didn't touch it yet. Instead, he moved to the second point, the service access hatch that opened into the lobby from behind the north wall, adjacent to the waterfall feature. Staff used it for maintenance access. It was not visible from the main entrance, not visible from the elevator bank, and positioned at an angle to Sandra's desk that meant the operative standing near her would be facing away from it when his back was to the waterfall. Nolan assessed the hatch, tried the handle, unlocked. He looked at his watch, not because time mattered in the way that appointment schedules made it matter, but because timing was the difference between a plan that worked and a plan that got people killed. He went back to the electrical panel, took one breath, slow and deliberate, the kind of breath that puts the body in a particular state. Not calm exactly, but organized, functional. He tripped the breaker. The lobby lights, half of them, the southern bank, cut out. In the half-dark, in the single second of confused repositioning that followed, Nolan was already through the service hatch. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean. Anyone who tells you that a real physical confrontation is clean is either lying or has never been in one. There is no clean. There are bodies in space, there is noise, there is the specific cognitive overload of multiple simultaneous inputs, and there is the difference between a person who is trained for that overload and a person who has only ever imagined it. The operative near Sandra was the first one Nolan reached. The man was competent, ex-military or trained close to it. That was clear from the way he adjusted to the sudden darkness, the way he moved toward a wall instead of away from it, the way his weapon came up at a controlled angle rather than wildly. He was competent, and he was expecting frightened civilians, and those two things were not compatible with what walked up behind him. Nolan took the weapon. It took 2.5 seconds and left the operative on the marble floor with a dislocated shoulder and very limited interest in continuing the engagement. Sandra made a sound behind her desk. Nolan turned briefly and put 2 fingers to his lips. She nodded. Her eyes were enormous and she was shaking badly, but she nodded, which meant she was going to be fine. He moved. The operative at the elevator bank heard him, heard something, the specific non-silence that precedes contact, and turned. He was faster than the first one. He got a shot off. The sound was enormous in the marble lobby. Several of the employees screamed or pressed themselves flatter. The shot went wide and took a piece of the waterfall feature with it, which sent a spray of water across the north wall. Nolan closed the distance in 3 steps. 3 specific angled steps that took him out of the second shot's trajectory and into the operative's space. And the engagement ended in approximately 4 seconds, the operative folding in the specific way that a controlled joint lock produces, controlled enough that the man was incapacitated rather than permanently damaged, which was the outcome Nolan was working toward. 2 down. He turned. The third operative, the one who'd been near the entrance, was already moving, already repositioning, already communicating to someone via the earpiece Nolan had clocked from the initial assessment. The operative was good. He was using the cover of the reception desk, using the employees near him as passive cover without pointing weapons directly at them, psychological leverage rather than direct threat. And he was angling for an exit, which meant the whole operation was collapsing, and he knew it. "Nobody moves," the operative said. His voice was flat, professional. He wasn't talking to the employees, he was talking to Nolan. Nolan stopped. He was 17 feet away behind the waterfall wall, partial cover. He assessed. "Back off," the operative said. "Walk out that service corridor and this ends right now. Nobody else gets hurt." "The man on the floor by the entrance," Nolan said. "Paul, is he alive?" A beat. "He's breathing." "How bad?" "He'll need a hospital. He doesn't need a body bag. Whether that changes depends on the next 30 seconds. Nolan believed him. Not because criminals were trustworthy, but because the body language was consistent with it. The operative was trying to exit, not escalate. An unconscious security guard was leverage. A dead one was a complication. "You're not getting out of the building," Nolan said. "The exits are covered. There are cameras everywhere, and your vehicle is going to be identified in the next 6 minutes. "That's my problem. Your people outside are running. 2 of them took off when the first shot went off. You can hear the sirens. You know police response is 2 minutes out. You're the only one still inside, which means you've been left." A silence. The kind of silence that has weight in it. The operative's eyes moved, just slightly, involuntarily, toward the main entrance, looking for the backup that wasn't coming. The small tell that confirmed what Nolan had said. He hadn't known for certain that the outside operatives had run. He'd assessed the probability at around 70% based on the shot going off early and the fact that this kind of freelance operation usually had a very specific risk threshold baked into the contract. He'd been right. "Put it down," Nolan said. "Not aggressive, not theatrical, just just the tone of a man stating an outcome. "This is over." The operative looked at him, really looked, the kind of assessment that professionals give each other across a situation, reading the body language, the positioning, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to certain kinds of people. Whatever he saw in Nolan, it was apparently sufficient. He placed the weapon on the granite floor. He put his hands up. And from outside, from the street, from the rain, from the direction of the lobby's main entrance, Nolan heard it. Sirens. Close. Getting closer. He exhaled. Around him, the lobby was a disaster. Broken marble, water from the damaged feature spreading across the floor, furniture overturned, employees scattered and shaking. Paul was still down, still breathing. Sandra was out from behind her desk, already on her phone, and the look she gave Nolan when their eyes met was the kind of look that doesn't have a word for it exactly. It's the look of someone who has just understood that the world is both more dangerous and more survivable than they had previously believed. Nolan crossed to Paul, checked his pulse, checked his airway, confirmed the injury, and made a fast assessment. Blunt trauma to the head. A club or a strike, not a bullet. Serious but manageable. He positioned Paul for recovery, made sure his airway was clear, and spoke quietly to the nearest employee about keeping pressure against the wound. Then he straightened up. The sirens were outside now. The lobby doors were shaking with the reflected light of police vehicles. Nolan looked down at his hands. His jacket was wet from the rain he'd walked in, damp from the waterfall spray, and there was a tear in the right sleeve that he didn't remember acquiring. His heart rate was elevated, not dramatically, but measurably, the way a body registers that it has done something significant. He thought about Dylan, about the noodle dinner, about the promise to be there for the actual dinner this time. Then the lobby doors burst open, and the tactical units came through, and the particular organized chaos of law enforcement taking control of a space descended over everything like a tide coming in. Nolan raised his hands and waited for someone to understand what had happened. It didn't take long. The first tactical officer through the door had his rifle at his chest and was already scanning the lobby in the practiced arc that meant he'd done this more times than he wanted to count. Behind him, 4 more officers in full kit fanned out, and the controlled chaos of a clearance operation filled the marble space. Barked commands, the shuffle of boots, the operatives on the floor being secured with a speed and efficiency that left no room for argument. Nolan stayed exactly where he was, hands raised, and said nothing. There was a protocol for this. He knew it. You did not move, you did not speak unless spoken to, and you absolutely did not reach for anything because the people coming through that door had arrived at a scene with shots fired and bodies on the floor, and their nervous systems were running hot, whether they looked calm or not. Down on your knees, hands laced behind your head. Nolan complied. The marble was wet and cold, and he could hear Sandra, somewhere to his left, talking rapidly to someone. Another officer, probably, the words tumbling out in the compressed, slightly breathless rhythm of someone trying to tell a whole story in 10 seconds. He caught fragments. He came in from the side. He stopped them. He stopped them. A hand on his shoulder, his arms pulled back. Zip tie, wrists together, standard. You armed? No. There are 3 weapons on the floor, one near the waterfall wall, one by the elevator bank, one on the reception side. All came from the operatives. A pause. The officer crouching behind him went still for just a second, the particular stillness of someone recalibrating, and then continued the search with somewhat less urgency than he'd started it. ID? Back left pocket. Driver's license. I don't have anything else on me. I was relieved of my employment earlier this evening. A beat. The Ashford Group. I was the personal chauffeur. Another pause. Nolan could hear, in the middle distance, the paramedics coming through the main entrance now. The rolling clatter of a gurney, voices switching to the clipped clinical shorthand of medical personnel. Paul. He hoped Paul was going to be straightforwardly fine, the kind of fine that included a headache and a workers' compensation claim and a story he'd tell for 20 years at family dinners. Don't move. Not planning to. The officer walked away. Nolan held his position on the wet marble, hands zip-tied behind him, rain still audible through the lobby's damaged front doors, and he thought about how he was going to explain this evening to his mother when he called to tell her he'd be late for dinner. She was going to have opinions. His mother always had opinions about the situations he found himself in, and those opinions were generally delivered with the particular combination of love and exasperation that only mothers who've spent years worrying about a child in dangerous places can properly achieve. He also thought about the picture frame. He'd left it against the parking meter on Callaway Street, 3 blocks in the rain. He was reasonably confident it was still there. Not many people stopped to pick up a stranger's framed photograph from a wet sidewalk, but the uncertainty was a low, persistent discomfort in the back of his mind. It was the only picture he had of Dylan from that day. The Mariners game. The boy had eaten 3 hot dogs and pronounced himself full after the second one, and then quietly eaten the third when he thought Nolan wasn't watching, and Nolan absolutely had been watching, but had decided that some things were better observed than corrected. Dylan's face in the photo, mid-laugh, cap slightly crooked, completely unguarded, was the expression Nolan was trying to build enough of a stable life to keep seeing. He was still thinking about the photo when he heard the voice. That's him. He recognized it immediately. The precise diction, the register that landed somewhere between authority and performance, slightly more clipped than usual, stress doing its small work on the edges. Celeste Ashford had come back inside. He didn't turn around because he was still zip-tied and kneeling, and it didn't seem like the right moment for a dramatic pivot. But he heard her footsteps crossing the lobby, the specific rhythm of her heels, which he had logged without intending to over 11 months of waiting beside open car doors. And then she was in his peripheral vision, standing to his left, and he could see without fully looking that she was wet. The rain had gotten to her in the time between the replacement vehicle call and the police arriving. Her blazer was dark across the shoulders, her hair slightly less architectural than it had been an hour ago. "Ma'am, please stay behind that man," she said, and her voice had the quality it got when she was not interested in being redirected. "Is not a suspect. He was trying to help. I need you to take those off of him right now." The officer started to explain the procedure, and Celeste interrupted him with the specific tone she used in boardrooms when someone was about to tell her about a process she found inconvenient. Nolan kept his eyes forward and waited. The fastest way through this particular moment was patience, which was true of most moments, but especially this one. 2 minutes later, a senior officer, Detective Reyes, based on the badge Nolan could now read, a compact woman in her 40s with the permanently slightly tired look of someone who'd been doing this job long enough to stop being surprised by anything, crouched in front of him and cut the zip tie with a small folding knife. "You want to tell me what happened?" "I was outside on Callaway when I heard the disturbance. I recognized the nature of the operation and decided to intervene." "Recognized how?" "Training." Reyes studied him. "What training?" "Navy. Prior service." "How prior?" 8 years. I got out 3 years ago." She wrote something down. "And you just happened to be outside." "I'd been let go by Ms. Ashford about 10 minutes earlier. I was walking to the parking structure." Reyes's pen stopped moving. She glanced up. Then she glanced past him, in the direction of Celeste, and something moved across her face. Not judgment exactly, more like the brief acknowledgement of a thing that was going to require some paperwork to fully address. "So you were fired, and then you came back in to protect the building." "I came back in to protect the people." She looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something else down. "Sit tight. I have more questions." "I know." He paused. "There's a picture frame on Callaway Street, against the parking meter closest to the east side entrance. Could someone— I'll see what I can do." She stood up and walked toward the elevator bank, where the second operative was being assessed by a paramedic. Nolan sat on the wet marble of the lobby floor, wrist-free now but still holding the configuration of someone who was going to stay exactly where he was until told otherwise, and looked at the damage. The waterfall feature was still running, sending a thin, persistent stream across the cracked tile below it. The black granite reception desk had a chip taken out of one corner. The entry doors were open and the night air was coming in, cold and rain-smelling, and the whole enormous lobby, which had been designed to make people feel a particular way about the Ashford Group's power and permanence, looked, in this moment, like what it actually was. A room that had been frightened. From across the lobby, he could hear Celeste talking to a different officer, answering the preliminary questions quickly and precisely in the way she did everything, and he could hear in her voice something that hadn't been there before. Not quite shakiness, She was holding herself together by the particular kind of discipline that high-functioning people develop, but something underneath the composure that sounded like the first cracks in it. The specific quality of a person who has just understood that the thing they'd been insulated from by money and security and all the careful architecture of their professional life had reached through all of it and touched them anyway. 40 minutes passed before things settled into something resembling order. Paul was conscious by the time the paramedics loaded him, groggy, head bandaged, deeply annoyed, which Nolan took as a positive sign. The 3 operatives had been transported, the 4th having been apprehended 2 blocks away by a patrol unit when the getaway SUV was flagged at a light. Detective Reyes had taken his full statement, which had been methodical and detailed and apparently consistent enough with the lobby footage to satisfy the initial questions, though she'd made very clear that there would be follow-up conversations in the coming days. Nolan had no objection to that. The lobby was still lit by the emergency systems. The south bank of lights he'd cut remained off, which gave the space an odd split quality, half lit and half in shadow. And the remaining employees who hadn't been dismissed to give statements were clustered near the reception area, most of them with the slightly untethered look of people who'd been told to go home an hour ago but couldn't quite make themselves do it yet. Sandra, the reception manager, had found him a cup of coffee at some point. He wasn't sure when. He'd been mid-conversation with Reyes and set it on the floor beside him without saying anything. When he'd looked at her, she'd just given him a look that communicated several things at once, and none of them required words. He'd drunk the coffee, which was too hot and slightly burnt and completely adequate. He was looking at this waterfall, still running, still sending its patient stream across the cracked tile, indifferent to everything that had happened in the room, when he heard her behind him. "Mr. Hayes," he turned. Celeste Ashford looked different than she had at any point in the 11 months he'd worked for her. The precision was still there. She was still standing straight, still wearing the blazer, still carrying herself with the posture of someone who took up space in a room intentionally. But she was wet, and she was pale, and she was looking at him in a way she'd never looked at him before. It was not quite the look of someone who had learned something they didn't want to know. It was more like the look of someone standing at the exact moment of that learning, right in the middle of it, not yet sure what to do with the information. She was holding something, his company ID badge, the laminated card he'd placed on the center console of the Mercedes before getting out. She was holding it in both hands, and she was looking at him, and she didn't immediately say anything else. He waited. "I came back," she said, and then stopped, as though she'd started a sentence she hadn't fully planned. She tried again. "When the replacement vehicle arrived, the driver said there were police at the building. I had already gotten out of the car. I told him I needed to go back." "You shouldn't have come back in. It wasn't secure yet." "I know." Something flickered. "I'm told that I tell other people what to do and I do exactly what I want. It's apparently a known pattern." The edge of it was self-aware, more self-aware than most things he'd heard her say. He didn't comment on it. She took a breath. "They told me what happened in here. Reyes, I asked her to explain it to me from the beginning, and she did." Another pause, shorter. "She told me that you'd been let go, that you were already off the property, that you heard it from outside and came back in anyway. I was still on the block. You were fired. The people in the lobby weren't." She looked at him for a long moment, and then looked down at the badge in her hands. She ran her thumb across the laminate, across the Ashford Group logo, across the small printed lines of his name and title. Nolan Hayes, personal chauffeur. "I said some things," she started, and then shook her head slightly, as though dismissing the euphemism. "I made a decision based on a single interaction and a series of assumptions that had nothing to do with your actual performance. I told you it was about a pattern, and that was—" She stopped. "That wasn't fully honest." Nolan said nothing. He was watching her the way he watched most things, attentive, neither pressing nor retreating. "It was about the route," she said. "I was in traffic I'd been told about, running late I'd been warned about, and instead of admitting any of that, I decided to call it something more significant." She looked up. That was wrong. The lobby was quiet around them. A couple of officers at the far end, voices low. The waterfall. The cold air from the open doors. "I appreciate you saying that," Nolan said. I'm not looking for you to make me feel better about it. I'm just saying it because it's true, and I should have said something honest instead of the other thing. She paused. Is the person Paul, is that his name? Is he? They said he was conscious. He is. Head injury. He'll be in the hospital tonight, probably tomorrow. He should be all right. She nodded. Something about the nod was unsteady in a way that the rest of her was working very hard not to be. In 7 years of running this company, I've never had, nothing like this has ever. She stopped again, pressed her lips together. When she spoke again, her voice was level, but the levelness was clearly costing her something. I keep thinking about the fact that you were already gone, that I had already sent you away and you came back anyway, and I don't. She paused. I don't understand that. Nolan considered how to answer that honestly. It wasn't about you, he said finally. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't loyalty to this company or to you personally. There were 14 people in that lobby who hadn't done anything except be at work on a Tuesday, and I had the ability to do something about that. She heard the distinction. He could see or hear it, the small internal adjustment of someone receiving information they hadn't been sure they wanted but are receiving it anyway. But you were fired, she said, almost like she was still testing the logic of it. Right, and the security guard was still on the floor. She was quiet for a moment, then, You don't hold anything back, do you? You said you wanted honesty. I did. Something in her expression shifted. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one. The loosening that happens when a person stops performing composure and starts just experiencing the moment they're in. Yes, I did say that. From across the lobby, Detective Reyes was moving in their direction with the specific, purposeful walk of someone who had 4 more things to get done before the end of her shift. She paused when she reached them, looked between Nolan and Celeste with the expression of a person who had seen enough of human behavior to read a room efficiently, and then she held something out to Nolan. The picture frame. Dylan in the red cap, mid-laugh, completely unguarded. One of my officers found it on Callaway. Rained on a little, but intact. Nolan took it. He looked at it for a second, just a second, enough to confirm the image was undamaged, and then held it against his side. Thank you. Reyes looked at it, then at him. Your son? Yeah. How old? 6. 6.5, technically. He's very committed to the half. Something moved across Reyes's face. The brief, unguarded softening that people allow themselves when children enter a conversation. I have 3. They're all committed to the half. She looked at him steadily. You're going to need to come in tomorrow for a follow-up, probably a couple of follow-ups. The DA's office is going to want to talk to you eventually as well. I know. Do you have an attorney? I'll get one. Good. Get one tonight if you can. She glanced at Celeste, not accusatory, just acknowledging, and then back at Nolan. You're free to go. We'll be in touch. She moved back toward the elevator bank. Nolan stood up, properly up, and stretched the kind of careful stretch that a person makes when they've been on a wet marble floor for 40 minutes and their knees are reminding them that 37 is not 22. Celeste was still there, still holding the ID badge. Your son, she said. Where is he now? My mother's. He's been waiting for dinner. You should go. I should. He paused. Do you have someone coming for you? The building's still an active crime scene. They're going to want people out soon. She blinked as though the question had caught her slightly off guard. Perhaps because it was the first time in the evening that someone had asked about her in a way that wasn't procedural. My security director is on his way, and about 6 other people who are all going to want to have an emergency meeting immediately. Don't let them schedule it tonight. She looked at him. You've had a significant trauma response this evening, he said. Not clinical exactly, just practical. You're holding it together well, but that's adrenaline and training and personality. The meeting will still be there tomorrow. Make them wait. She opened her mouth to say something that would probably have been reflexively dismissive, and then she closed it. The small pause of a person actually receiving advice instead of deflecting it. All right, she said. All right, yes, tomorrow. He nodded. picked up his backpack from where an officer had set it during the initial search and confirmation of its contents, slung it over one shoulder. She held the badge out to him. He looked at it for a moment. He'd placed it on the center console 45 minutes ago as a terminal gesture. The particular finality of handing back the thing that marked you as belonging to a place. But she was holding it toward him with both hands, which was more than an offering. It was a question. He took it. Not because everything was resolved. It wasn't. Not because the evening had ended well for everyone. It hadn't. Paul was in an ambulance, and 3 other people were going to need follow-up conversations with therapists they probably didn't have yet. Not because of any grand gesture or moment of cathartic clarity. He took it because she was asking, and the question was sincere, and sincerity, in Nolan's experience, deserved to be met rather than dismissed. "Call HR in the morning," he said. "Have them reach me." "I will." He walked toward the Callaway Street exit, the same one he'd entered through, the one with the door that responded to the code that hadn't been changed. He paused at the threshold and turned back. Not dramatically, just checking. An old habit. Always know what's behind you when you leave. Celeste was still standing in the middle of her damaged lobby, the emergency lights casting half of her in shadow and the other half in white fluorescence, and she was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before and couldn't fully name. Not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. Something more like the face of a person who has just been shown, very abruptly and very concretely, the distance between what they thought they knew and what is actually true. He pushed through the door. Outside, the rain had eased to a thin drizzle, the aftermath of the earlier downpour, the city cleaned and slightly steaming in the way it got after a real rain. The parking meter on Callaway Street stood empty. He held the picture frame up briefly in the streetlight, checked the glass again. Intact. Dylan's face unchanged by the whole evening, which was exactly as it should be. Nolan started walking toward the parking structure. His phone was in his hand before he'd gone half a block. He called his mother. She picked up on the second ring. "You're late," she said. "I know. I'm sorry. Dylan ate. I told him to wait, but he's 6 and there are noodles." "That's fair?" A pause. His mother had a specific silence for when she was looking at the tone of his voice rather than the words. She'd had it for as long as he could remember, and it still worked. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." A beat. It was a complicated evening. How complicated? "I'll tell you when I get there." He exhaled. "Tell Dylan I'm on my way. Tell him I said 20 minutes. Is it actually 20 minutes? Probably 30. Tell him 20 so he doesn't fall asleep waiting." A pause. Then a sound that was almost a laugh, weighted with something larger than amusement. "Get here safe," his mother said. And then, quietly, because she had always known exactly when to say it and when not to, "I'm glad you're all right." "Me too." He ended the call. Above the parking structure entrance, a single light buzzed steadily, slightly too bright against the wet dark. Somewhere on the street behind him, a siren called once and went quiet. The city resuming its ordinary sounds, the way cities do, indifferent to specific evenings, moving forward with the blunt momentum of a thing that has been through worse and will be through worse again. Nolan found his car on the 3rd level. A 7-year-old Civic, dark blue, one small dent in the rear passenger door from a parking garage pillar 6 months ago that he kept meaning to fix. He put the picture frame on the passenger seat, set the backpack in the back, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. His hands were steady on the wheel. He thought about Celeste in the lobby, holding his badge. He thought about Paul in the ambulance. He thought about Dylan eating noodles without him and his mother watching the news, with the particular vigilance of a woman who had spent too many years watching news that might contain her son. He thought about the promise he'd made to himself when he left the Navy, the one he'd articulated badly to Dylan over brownies in the kitchen, the one about choosing to come back from danger instead of walking toward it. He'd made that choice. He was still making it. Tonight hadn't changed it. It had just complicated it, the way most things worth doing were complicated. He started the engine, pulled out of the parking structure, pointed the Civic toward his mother's house, toward the noodle dinner, toward the 6-year-old who was going to pretend he hadn't been worried but absolutely had. The picture frame sat in the passenger seat the whole way there, Dylan grinning in the red cap, completely unaware of what the Tuesday evening had been like for the person driving. which was, Nolan thought, exactly right. The noodles were cold by the time he got there. His mother, Margaret Hayes, 63 years old, 5'2", and possessed of a moral authority that had nothing to do with her height, had kept a portion in a covered bowl on the stove, which was warm enough to take the edge off the cold but not warm enough to be what dinner actually was. Nolan ate standing at the kitchen counter because Dylan had finally fallen asleep on the couch at 9:15. One sock on and one sock off, in the way children collapsed when the evening finally outran them, a half-finished drawing on the coffee table in front of him, a car, roughly rendered in blue crayon, with what appeared to be a figure in a uniform standing beside it. Nolan had stood in the doorway of the living room for a moment longer than necessary, looking at his son, before going to the kitchen. Margaret didn't ask the questions while he was eating. She had that discipline. She made him a second cup of coffee he hadn't asked for and set it beside his bowl and sat down at the kitchen table with her own cup. And she waited until he'd finished before she said anything at all. "You called it complicated," she said. "I did. That's the word you used the night you came home from Fallujah and wouldn't say anything for 3 days. That was different. I know it was different. I'm noting the word choice." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Tell me." So he told her. Not everything. Not the full tactical sequence. Not the details about the operative's training levels or the specific mechanics of the engagement, because those weren't the details that mattered at a kitchen table at 10 at night. He told her the broad shape of it, fired, walking away, the sound from the lobby, going back in. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was the thing about her that most people didn't know, that she could be completely still when she was receiving something important. The woman who had opinions about everything could also, when the moment required it, simply be present. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "And the boy?" she said. "Not Dylan. The security guard. Paul. He was conscious when they loaded him. I called the hospital before I drove over. He's stable. They're keeping him overnight for observation, maybe tomorrow as well." She nodded. Her hands tightened slightly around the mug and then released. "And you're telling me you're fine, Mug. I'm telling you I'm not hurt. That's not the same thing, and you know it." He did know it. He looked at his coffee. "I don't know what I am yet. I'll figure it out." It was honest enough that she accepted it, though the look she gave him over the rim of her mug communicated that she had a reserved position on the topic and was simply choosing not to deploy it at this particular moment. Margaret Hayes had always been precise about which battles to have immediately and which ones to let sit. "Dylan drew a picture," he said. "He draws you a picture every time you're late. He won't say it's because he was worried. He'll say it's because he was bored." "I know. Don't make him explain it. Just take the picture." "I know, Mom." She reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly. Not dramatic, not prolonged, just a touch that said, "I see you in the specific language of a parent who has said it 10,000 times in 10,000 different ways." And then she picked up her mug again, and the moment passed into the ordinary texture of the evening. He carried Dylan to bed without waking him. The boy weighed 49 pounds and had the complete boneless quality of a deeply sleeping child, and Nolan stood beside the bed for a moment after pulling the blanket up, watching the easy rise and fall of his son's breathing in the dim room. The drawing was in his jacket pocket. He'd taken it from the coffee table on his way through. He drove home at 11. His own apartment was 12 minutes away, a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building that was clean and unremarkable and suited him precisely because it made no demands. He'd decorated it with the specific minimalism of someone who'd spent 8 years in environments where everything you owned had to be portable and hadn't entirely shed that instinct. A couch, a bookshelf. Dylan's bedroom, that was more fully furnished than his own, because making a child feel at home required a different set of priorities than making yourself feel at home. He set the picture frame on the kitchen counter where the light caught it. Then he sat down on the couch and did what he usually did in the aftermath of an event that had required him to be a specific kind of person. He waited. Waited for the body to finish its accounting. The adrenaline residue, the muscle memory of controlled violence, the specific weight of having been in a situation where outcomes weren't guaranteed and having come out the other side. It wasn't like the movies. It wasn't trembling hands or sudden tears or a cinematic reckoning. It was more like a room that had been very loud going quiet, and the quiet being its own kind of adjustment. He made a list in his head, the way he always had. Things that needed to happen. Attorney, Reyes had been right about that. He'd need someone before the DA follow-ups. The follow-up with the police department tomorrow. HR at the Ashford Group to clarify the employment question. And at some point, a conversation with Dylan about why Dad had been late, which would require a version of the truth that was honest without being the kind of honest that made a 6-year-old afraid. He was still working through the list when he fell asleep on the couch, which he hadn't intended to do, still wearing his jacket, the picture frame on the kitchen counter, and the city humming quietly 12 stories below. The attorney's name was Vera Kwan. She was 51, ran a small firm out of a converted row house 4 blocks from the courthouse, and had been recommended by a former Navy colleague who described her as someone who understood how to talk to people who'd done things that were difficult to explain to civilians without making it sound worse than it was. The description had been accurate. Nolan met with her at 7:30 the next morning, which she apparently preferred. She'd answered his call at 10:15 the previous night with the alert efficiency of someone who kept odd hours by choice rather than necessity. And when he described the situation in broad terms, she'd said, "Tomorrow morning, 7:30, bring whatever documentation you have," in a tone that suggested she'd heard more complicated situations over breakfast. He didn't have much documentation. His employment contract, the severance terms, his discharge papers from the Navy, which she read through with the focused attention of someone who knew what they were looking for. "Prior operations?" she said without looking up. "Yes." "Level?" "Classified." She nodded. That was apparently sufficient. "Commendations?" "Several." "Any disciplinary actions during service?" "No." "Since separation?" "No." She set the papers down and looked at him over reading glasses that she wore at the end of her nose in the way that suggested she only wore them at all under protest. "Here's the situation. You intervened in an active crime scene as a civilian. You used physical force, significant physical force, on multiple individuals. You did this without any official authorization. The DA's office is going to look at this carefully." "I know. However," she continued, "the security footage is apparently comprehensive, the witness accounts are consistent, and 3 of the people you quote-unquote subdued are facing federal kidnapping conspiracy charges, which means their attorneys are going to advise them strongly against making any counterclaims that might complicate their own legal position." She paused. "And from what you've described of the tactical context, the actions you took were proportional and targeted. You didn't hurt anyone you weren't required to hurt." "That was deliberate." "I know. That's why you're sitting in my office at 7:30 in the morning instead of a holding cell." She picked up a pen. "Tell me about the employment termination. Everything. The route, what she said, how you responded." "Exactly." He told her. She took notes with the speed of someone who had done this for a long time and had stopped needing to write down the unnecessary parts. When he finished, she looked at her notes for a moment. "She's asked to reinstate you?" "She asked me to return. Informally. In the lobby last night. She said to have HR contact me." "Have they?" "3 times. Starting at 8 this morning." His phone had buzzed on the drive over. HR director. Then again, then a different number he'd identified as Celeste Ashford's executive assistant. "I haven't returned the calls yet." Vera studied him. "What do you want?" "I want to know where I stand legally before I have any further conversations with the Ashford Group." "That's smart." She tapped the pen against her notepad. "What do you want from the situation overall? Not legally? Personally." He thought about it. "I want my son's life not to be disrupted. I want the legal exposure from last night resolved cleanly. And I want, if I go back to work for her, I want it to be on terms that don't put me in the same position I was in before." "What position was that?" He thought about how to say it. "I was good at my job." She mistook good at my job for having nothing worth paying attention to. Those aren't the same thing. Vera looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not unprofessional, just the brief acknowledgement of a human truth. "No," she said, "they're not." She closed the notepad. "Here's what I recommend. I talk to the DA's office first. I have a relationship with 2 of the assistant DAs, and I can get a clearer picture of where this is going. You don't talk to the Ashford Group until I've done that. Give me 48 hours. And Paul? The security guard? What about him?" I want to know if there's anything I can do. From a legal standpoint, does his workers' comp situation get complicated by what happened? Is there anything that... Vera raised a hand slightly. One thing at a time, Mr. Hayes. Let me clear your immediate situation, and then we'll look at anything adjacent. She paused. For what it's worth, the fact that you're asking about the security guard before you ask about the employment negotiation tells me quite a bit about where your priorities are. Is that useful information? It's useful to know who I'm working with. She stood, which was apparently the signal that the meeting was over. 48 hours. Don't return those calls. Don't speak to the press if they contact you. And they will, because this story is going to be in the news today. He hadn't thought about the press. He looked at her. How bad? Check your phone. He did, on the sidewalk outside her office. 4 missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. A text from his former Navy colleague that read, "Dude, you're on CNN." And when he searched his own name, which he did not make a habit of, the results that came back were immediate and numerous, the specific kind of news cycle that a story generates when it has a clean narrative. Billionaire's fired driver returns to save her life. The details were approximately 70% accurate, which in his experience was about as good as news coverage ever got. He put his phone in his pocket and walked to his car. The 48 hours were not quiet. He didn't watch the news coverage. He made that decision consciously and held to it, because in his experience, watching coverage of something you were directly involved in was almost always counterproductive. It gave you a version of events that had been shaped for consumption, and then you spent energy being annoyed by the inaccuracies instead of focusing on the things that actually mattered. He took Dylan to school on Wednesday morning. Dylan had heard a fragment of something from his grandmother the previous night. Not the details, but enough to understand that something significant had happened. And on the drive to school, he'd been quieter than usual, watching Nolan with the careful lateral attention of a child who is trying to determine something without asking directly. At the school drop-off lane, before Dylan got out, he'd turned in the seat. "Dad." "Yeah." "Did you do something dangerous?" Nolan looked at him. Dylan's face was serious in the way that 6-year-old faces rarely are. Not fearful exactly, more like bracing. The face of someone who has already decided they can handle whatever the answer is, but wants the actual answer. "Yeah," Nolan said. "A little." Dylan absorbed this. "Were you the kind of dangerous or the other kind?" It was phrasing they'd developed over the years, imprecisely and organically, as a way of distinguishing between the kind of dangerous that was reckless, the kind Nolan had spent effort teaching Dylan to recognize and avoid, and the kind that was protective, the kind that went toward something instead of just into it. "The other kind," Nolan said. Dylan looked at him for another moment, doing the internal calculus that children do when they're processing something that lives at the edge of their current framework. Then he nodded, the deliberate nod of a person who has filed the information where it belongs. He picked up his backpack. "Okay," he said. "Save me a snack." He got out of the car and walked toward the school entrance without looking back, which was the way Dylan always did drop-off, with the forward momentum of someone who was committed to arriving. And Nolan watched him until he'd gone through the door. Then he sat in the drop-off lane for a moment too long, until the car behind him tapped its horn, and he pulled forward. Bam. On Thursday morning, Vera called. "DA's office is not pursuing charges," she said. The footage was as clean as advertised. 3 of the 4 operatives have given statements that, while self-serving in other respects, are consistent with your account of events. The security guard... She paused briefly. "Paul Okereke. His attorney has actually reached out to ask whether you'd be willing to speak with him directly." "When?" "Whenever you're available. He's being discharged from the hospital today." "Today's fine. I'll send you his contact information." He called Paul Okereke at noon. The man picked up with the careful voice of someone whose head still hurt, and they talked for about 15 minutes, not about the legal specifics, which Vera had advised him to avoid, but about the evening itself. Paul had been conscious for some of it, longer than the medical team had initially thought, conscious in the drifting way that a blow to the head produces. And he had fragmented impressions of the lobby after the lights went out. Noise, movement, the specific sounds of a situation being controlled. My wife keeps asking me what you look like, Paul said at one point. Average. She wants to send you something. I've been trying to talk her out of it because I don't know what you send someone in that situation, but she's very determined. Tell her it's not necessary. I've told her. She's not accepting it. A pause. You used to be in the military, the news said. Navy, 8 years. My brother was Army, 2 tours. Another pause. He says people who've been over there, they come back and sometimes they don't know what to do with what they have. All that training, nowhere to put it. Nolan thought about that. That's part of it. You found somewhere to put it. I found a parking meter to stand in front of mostly. Paul made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a wince. My head still hurts too much to laugh, man. Then don't. Then don't. Yeah, okay. A longer pause, warmer. Thank you. I mean it. I know you know that, but I need to say it anyway. I know, Nolan said. Get some rest. He hung up and sat for a moment in the apartment, the phone face down on the counter, the picture frame beside it. He'd moved it from where he'd left it the first night, set it properly against the kitchen backsplash where he could see it from the table. Dylan mid-laugh, red cap, completely unguarded. His phone buzzed again. Vera. He picked up. One more thing, she said. Celeste Ashford has been calling my office. Directly? Her attorney has. They want to negotiate the reinstatement. Mr. Hayes, I want you to be prepared for this. They're not approaching it as a simple reinstatement. He waited. They're proposing a restructured employment agreement, significantly better compensation, a revised title, Director of Executive Security rather than personal chauffeur, benefits package improvements. And Ms. Ashford has asked, specifically, to speak with you directly before anything is formalized, not through attorneys. Nolan looked at the ceiling. When? She's asking for today, if you're available. Tell her 4 o'clock, he said. The Ashford Group's headquarters had repaired the lobby doors and replaced the cracked tile on the north side, but the waterfall feature was still offline, a tarp over it, a maintenance notice taped to the wall. The lobby felt different in the daylight, more ordinary, the way places where significant things have happened always normalize themselves faster than you expect. A few employees glanced at him when he came in. Recognition flickers, the particular awareness of a person who has been on the news. But nobody said anything, which suited him. The receptionist, a young man he didn't recognize, covering for Sandra, who had reportedly taken the day, sent him up to the 42nd floor. The executive level was the opposite of the lobby in the sense that it worked very hard not to look like it was working hard. Understated, expensive without announcing it. A view of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows that on a clear afternoon like this one showed the skyline in the particular quality of autumn light that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. Celeste's assistant, a careful-looking man named Marcus, who Nolan had dealt with occasionally over 11 months, met him at the elevator. She's on a call. She'll be 3 minutes. Can I get you anything? I'm fine. He waited in a chair outside the office. Through the closed door, he could hear Celeste's voice. Not the words, just the rhythm of it, the cadence she used when she was in a conversation where she was controlling the pace. After about 4 minutes, the call ended and Marcus opened the door. She was standing at the window when he came in. That was new. Every meeting he'd ever had proximity to, she was at her desk or at the conference table in the adjacent room. Standing at the window was something different, something less structured. She turned when she heard him come in. She looked, he thought, like someone who hadn't slept particularly well for 2 nights, which was understandable, and also the first time he'd ever seen evidence that she was capable of not sleeping well, since everything about her previous presentation had suggested a person who processed the world without friction. Nolan, she said, then with the slight recalibration of someone who has used a familiar form of address and isn't sure it landed correctly. Is that all right? It felt strange to say Mr. Hayes. It's fine. She gestured toward the seating area. 2 chairs, a low table between them, city and the windows behind. They both sat down. For a moment, neither of them said anything, which would have been uncomfortable in most meetings, but landed differently here. 2 people who had been through something together, taking a breath before talking about it. I've been trying to figure out how to start this conversation for 2 days, she said. Start wherever's true. She looked at him. Wherever's true. All right. She set her hands on the arms of the chair, not fidgeting, just settling. I've been running this company for 7 years. I built it from basically nothing, and I did that by making decisions faster than other people and being right more often than I was wrong. I know how that sounds, but it's an honest description. And somewhere in those 7 years, I started treating speed as a virtue in itself. Fast decisions, fast assessments, fast judgments about people. A pause. You were at the end of 11 months of that, and I handled it badly. You handled it the way you always handle things. I know, that's what I said. He almost smiled. She noticed, and something in her expression loosened fractionally. The route, he said. The route, she agreed. I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong in the car, and I doubled down anyway, because admitting it in the moment felt like losing something. I don't know what exactly. Some version of being right. She paused. Then I sat in traffic I'd been warned about, and sent you away for warning me, and went back to a building where people almost... She stopped, pressed forward. And you came back anyway. I've explained why. You have. I've been thinking about the explanation. She was looking at him with the full attention she usually reserved for people she considered worth paying close attention to, which he had not previously been included among. You said it wasn't about me, that it was about the people in the lobby. That's true. But you came back to the same building you'd just been fired from, to protect people employed by the company that fired you. You can say it wasn't about me, but the building had my name on it, and you went in anyway. He considered how to answer that accurately. The people in the building had nothing to do with what happened between us. Paul Okereke doesn't work for you because of any opinion about how you treat people. He works for you because it's his job and he needed a job, probably, same as everyone else in that lobby. Separating what they deserved from what happened with you wasn't difficult. She was quiet for a moment. That's a kind of thinking I'm not sure I'm capable of. You can learn it. Can you? You're asking me to teach you. I'm asking you to come back. She said it directly, which he appreciated. No orchestration, no preamble. The title, the compensation package, all of that is real and I mean it. But that's not why I'm asking. I'm asking because you're the first person who's told me something true in a long time without wanting something from me. And I've been running this company on the assumption that everybody wants something and I need to stay faster than they're wanting. She paused. That's exhausting. It sounds like it. Don't do that. Do what? Give me the kind of answer that makes me feel understood without actually telling me what you think. She looked at him steadily. Tell me what you think. He looked at her for a moment. She was right. He'd been managing the conversation, which was a habit that served him well most of the time and wasn't fully appropriate here. I think you're smart and you've built something real, and you've been running it in a way that's going to become a ceiling eventually, if it hasn't already, he said. Not because you're not capable enough, but because you've been treating capability as a replacement for everything else. You're 30 years old, and I'd bet the last time someone pushed back on you without an agenda was far enough back that you can't remember it easily. She held his gaze. My CFO pushes back. On numbers. Does he push back on anything else? A pause. No? That's what I thought. He let that sit for a second. I'll come back. Under one condition. Not the one in the outline you've prepared, not the title or the contract. Those are fine and we'll sort those out. The condition is this. When I tell you something, you take it seriously the same way you take the CFO's numbers. Not because I'll always be right. Because I'm watching things you're not watching, and I'm telling you what I actually see, not what's convenient to tell you. She looked at him for a long moment. The city was gold in the windows behind her, late afternoon doing what it did this time of year, making everything briefly more beautiful than it had any right to be. That's all? That's not a small thing. No, she said. It's not. A pause. But yes. Agreed. He nodded. She put out her hand, which was the most natural gesture he'd seen from her. Not the formal boardroom handshake, just a person sealing something real. He shook it. Monday? She said. Monday. He stood. She stood. They were briefly both standing in the same space, which was the first time that had happened in 11 months of him holding doors and driving cars and being invisible by mutual unspoken agreement, and the difference was noticeable to both of them without either of them naming it. "Your son," she said as he moved toward the door. You mentioned him the other night. Dylan." He turned. "When I was driving away from the building before I came back, I saw you from the car. You were holding the picture frame. I could see it was a child." She paused, and there was something in the pause that was careful and also genuine. "I thought if anything had happened in that lobby, I thought about the fact that someone's father had come back in." He looked at her. She was not performing this. The woman who performed everything was simply standing in her own office saying something true. "He's fine," Nolan said. "He drew me a car." Something moved across her face. "Good," she said. "That's—" She stopped. "Good." He nodded once and left. In the elevator down, he looked at the city through the glass panel on the east-facing wall. 42 floors of it, the buildings catching the last of the afternoon light, the streets below already moving into the particular density of rush hour. All of it busy, all of it indifferent, all of it continuing with the patient momentum that cities maintain regardless of what any individual Tuesday evening contains. His phone buzzed. "Dylan, Grandma says she needs 10 more minutes. I drew you another car. This one has a flag." He typed back, "I'll be there in 20. Then, after a pause, "Save the car for me. 3 dots. Then, obviously." The elevator reached the lobby. The maintenance tarp over the waterfall feature rustled slightly in the air from the repaired entry doors. Nolan walked across the marble floor, past the reception desk, past the place where Paul had been on the floor 2 nights ago, and out through the main entrance into the afternoon. He didn't look back. He started on Monday, as agreed. The title change meant a different parking credential, a different access level, and a different set of responsibilities that Vera had reviewed and annotated before he'd signed anything. Director of Executive Security was a title that carried weight in the Ashford Group's organizational structure. It sat above the existing security director, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had held the position for 4 years and who received the news of Nolan's appointment with the careful neutrality of someone who had not yet decided how to feel about it. Nolan had requested a meeting with Fitch on his first morning before anything else. Not because Vera had suggested it and not because Celeste had arranged it, but because walking into an organization above someone who didn't know what you were going to do or what you thought of their existing work was a reliable way to create problems that didn't need to exist. Fitch's office was on the 3rd floor. A functional room, well organized, the kind of space that reflected a person who took their work seriously, even if the work had been allowed to develop certain blind spots. Fitch himself was 54, former police, 20 years on the force before transitioning to private security. Solid background. The kind of solid that can become comfortable in a way that isn't always visible from the inside. "I want to be straight with you," Nolan said, about 3 minutes into the conversation, after the preliminary exchange of credentials and the particular careful politeness of 2 professionals trying to read each other across a desk. Fitch looked at him. "All right. I'm not here to gut your operation or make you feel like Tuesday means everything you've built here is garbage. The existing protocols have worked in the context they were designed for. The problem is that context changed and the protocols didn't catch up. That's a resource and attention problem, not a competence problem." Fitch was quiet for a moment. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate. The shift change vulnerability that the crew exploited Tuesday, that's not an exotic tactic. It's one of the first things covered in basic facilities security assessment. The fact that it wasn't addressed isn't because you didn't know about it. It's because nobody with budget authority considered it a priority." Fitch looked at his desk. Something in his posture shifted. Not defensive, more like a person setting down a thing they've been carrying. "I submitted a security review 14 months ago, flagged the transition gaps. It went to the operations VP and got classified as a low-priority capital item." "I know, I read it." Fitch looked up. "You read the review." "Celeste gave me access to the last 3 years of internal security documentation over the weekend. Your review was thorough. Some of the equipment recommendations were a little expensive and could be substituted, but the structural observations were right." He paused. "The budget decision that shelved it wasn't yours." The silence in the room was different after that. Fitch leaned back in his chair and let out a breath that had clearly been waiting for a while to be exhaled. So what does this look like, practically? You run day-to-day operations. You know this building. You know the staff. You know the vendor relationships. I'm not here to replace that. I don't want it, and you're better positioned for it anyway. What I'm here to do is close the gap between what the operation looks like on paper and what it needs to be given the actual risk profile this company has now, which has changed significantly. The kidnapping attempt wasn't random. Someone planned that operation, which means someone assessed her as a target worth planning around. That changes the baseline threat level for everyone in this building. Fitch nodded slowly. The police released some of the investigative information this morning. The crew is professional. 2 of them have priors in Europe. High-value target extraction. They were hired. I know. Detective Reyes called me this morning. Nolan paused. Which means there's a client somewhere who still has a reason to want Celeste Ashford off the board. The 4 men in custody aren't the end of this. Fitch was fully alert now. The comfortable, settled quality gone, replaced with the attention of a man who remembered what it felt like to work a case that actually mattered. You think there's another attempt? I think we should operate as though there is until we have information that says otherwise. He stood. I'm going to need everything you have on building access logs for the 6 weeks prior to Tuesday. I want to see who was in and out that didn't belong. I can have that by end of day. Good. Nolan moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. Paul Okereke. When she's cleared to come back, I want a meeting with him before he returns to his post. Not review, not evaluation. I want to know what he observed in the weeks before Tuesday. Security personnel see things that don't make it into reports. Fitch looked at him steadily. He's a good man. I know. That's why I want to talk to him. The first week back was an education in what Celeste Ashford's company actually was beneath the surface that she projected to the world. The Ashford Group dealt in mid-market commercial real estate development, acquisition, renovation, and management of office and mixed-use properties across a 5-state region. It was a straightforward business model executed with Celeste's particular brand of aggressive precision, and on the surface it ran with the efficiency that the 42nd floor's understated expensive aesthetics suggested. But surfaces, as Nolan was trained to read them, were usually the least informative part of any structure. He walked the building methodically in his first 3 days. Not the executive floors. Those were well understood and relatively simple from a security standpoint, but the loading docks, the mechanical floors, the parking structure's camera-dead zones, the places where the building's daily operational life happened without anyone on the 42nd floor thinking about it. He talked to the custodial team, the maintenance staff, the day security personnel who worked the lower floors, and the overnight team who worked alone in a building that became a very different environment between 2 and 4 in the morning. He took notes in a narrow notebook, the old habit from the Navy, handwritten rather than typed because his hands remembered things his phone couldn't. On Wednesday morning, Sandra, back from her day off, and apparently having decided that almost being held at gunpoint entitled her to speak freely to anyone in the building regardless of their title, appeared in his new office doorway with a coffee. You walked past my desk 4 times yesterday without stopping, she said. I wanted to check that you were actually here and not a rumor. I was assessing the lobby sight lines from 4 different angles. The coverage is inconsistent. He accepted the coffee. Thank you. She leaned against the doorframe with the ease of someone who had worked in the same building long enough to own her small section of it. Can I ask you something? You're going to regardless. Probably. She paused. Why'd you come back? I mean, after what she did. You could have gone somewhere else. The news coverage alone, you could have gone anywhere. He thought about the answer that was true, rather than the one that was tidy. Because the problem here is fixable, and I know how to fix it, and because she asked honestly. Sandra considered this. She's never asked honestly for anything in the 4 years I've worked here. She tells, and she tells well, and she makes you feel like the telling is a privilege. She's changing that. Sandra gave him the look of a person who had heard a lot of assertions about how things were changing in the organizations they'd worked for. We'll see. Yeah, he said, we will. She took the look of a woman who was willing to reserve judgment and left him to his notebook. The conversation with Celeste that changed things. Not the first conversation, or the Thursday conversation in her office, but the one that actually shifted the underlying architecture of how they worked, happened on Wednesday afternoon of his second week in the car. She'd had him drive her to a site visit in the East Corridor, a mixed-use property acquisition she'd been evaluating for 6 months. And on the way back through the city, stuck in the same general category of traffic that had characterized their last drive together, she'd said something without looking up from her tablet. "Fitch told me you read his 14-month-old review." "I did." "He seemed... I don't know what he seemed like. Different." She paused. "He came to me yesterday about the budget item, the access control upgrade. He wasn't apologetic about it. He just presented it like a current active requirement and asked for a decision." "What did you decide?" "I approved it." Another pause. "I wanted to ask you why you didn't come to me directly with it." He checked the mirror, changed lanes, returned his eyes to the road. "Because it was Fitch's work. His assessment, his observation, his recommendation. If I'd taken it to you, it would have been my name on the resolution. And instead, Fitch got the decision. Fitch got the decision and the recognition for a correct call that he made 14 months ago and got ignored. Which means the next time he makes a correct call, he'll bring it up again." He glanced in the rear view briefly. "You want people who keep bringing things to you. The way you make that happen is by treating what they bring seriously." She was quiet for a moment. The tablet went dark in her hands. "That's not how I've operated," she said. "No. I've been taking credit for the work of the people around me without... I haven't been doing it maliciously. I just never thought about whose name was on things because the name I thought about was mine." "I know. You know. You've been watching me for 11 months and you know." There was no accusation in it, just a flat statement of a thing being real. "What else do you know?" He thought about whether to answer that fully. The agreement they'd made in her office. When I tell you something, take it seriously. Cut both ways. He wasn't going to use the information he'd accumulated to make her feel bad, but he wasn't going to manage it into meaninglessness either. "Your executive assistant Marcus has been carrying responsibilities above his title for 2.5 years. Your VP of operations thinks she's next in line for the CFO position, and she's probably right, but no one's told her that, so she's been quietly exploring external opportunities. And your CFO, who you rely on for the pushback you mentioned, is 61 and has been having preliminary conversations with headhunters, which means you have maybe 18 months before you lose the one person in the room who tells you things you don't want to hear." The car was very quiet. "How do you know any of that?" she said. "People talk to support staff differently than they talk to executives. Drivers, security, reception. We're in the room for conversations that aren't meant for us, and we're invisible enough that people forget to guard their language." He paused. "I've been invisible for 11 months. Another silence. Longer. "Marcus," she said finally, "what would he need?" A title that reflects what he actually does. And someone to tell him they've noticed. He's not going to ask. "People like that never do," she said, almost to herself. Then, "The VP of operations, Donna." "Donna Reyes Park, yes. Not the detective. Different Reyes." "Tell me what to say to her." He thought about it. "Don't say anything scripted. She'll hear it. Just be direct. Tell her what you see in her and where you think she's going. Don't position it. Don't make it a retention conversation. Just tell her the truth. The truth being that she's good. The truth being that you've noticed she's good. People can tell the difference." She turned to look at the back of his head. He could see it in the mirror, the full attention that she gave things when she'd stopped managing them. "You think about people. Occupational habit. No, you actually think about them, not tactically. You think about what they need, what they're carrying." A pause. "That's not a driver's skill. It's not a military skill either, technically. It's just paying attention to things other than the objective. Most of the people I've worked with treat the objective as the only thing worth paying attention to. Most of the people you've hired probably learned that from working with you." She turned back toward the window. "That's the most uncomfortable thing you've said to me, and you've said several uncomfortable things. You asked what I know." "I did." A long pause. The city moved past. "I'm going to need you to keep doing that, saying the uncomfortable things." "I intend to, even when I push back." Especially then. She almost said something else and then didn't. Instead, she looked at her tablet again, but the quality of the silence in the car was different than it had ever been in 11 months of her in the back seat and him in the front. Not the silence of a transaction, a service being rendered invisibly, but the silence of two people who had arrived at some mutual understanding that didn't require announcement. 3 weeks after he came back, the investigation produced something concrete. Detective Reyes, the actual one, the woman from the lobby with the 3 children committed to their halves, called Nolan on a Thursday afternoon with the particular tone of someone delivering information they expect to be significant to the recipient. "The client," she said. "The person who hired the crew. You have a name. We have a name and a motive that's going to matter to you and Ms. Ashford both." A pause. "You know the Callaway Group?" Nolan was quiet for a second. He was in his office, notebook open, the access logs from the prior week spread across his desk. "Real estate development? Competitor. They've been trying to acquire the Westfield portfolio for 18 months. Ms. Ashford outbid them twice. The third time, 3 weeks before the incident, they were outbid again, and the deal closed." Another pause. "The principal behind the Callaway Group has a history of non-standard competitive practices. We've had 2 previous complaints from other businesses. Both died before they got anywhere. This one's different, because this time someone ended up on a lobby floor. And because 2 of the 4 operatives have flipped in a way that makes it very hard for the principal to walk away from this clean." A pause. "I wanted you to know before it becomes public. Probably tomorrow. Does Celeste know yet?" "She's being contacted by the DA's office in the next hour. I'll be there when they call." There was a brief silence on the line. "Mr. Hayes, for what it's worth, the DA's office is confident on this one. This isn't going to be a situation where the money protects someone." "I appreciate that." "Thank you for not being dead," she said, which was the bluntest expression of professional regard he'd received in a long time. "It would have made my paperwork significantly worse." He was already in the elevator to the 42nd floor before she'd finished the sentence. Celeste received the call from the DA's office at 4:17 with Nolan in the room, and he watched her do the thing she did when she was holding the surface together while the interior processed something. The slight compression of her expression, the quality of stillness in her hands, the way she said, "Yes, I understand, and thank you for letting me know," in the flat professional register she used when the words were about containment rather than communication. When she put the phone down, she didn't say anything for a moment. "Callaway?" she said. "Yes. We beat them on 3 acquisitions. I knew they were frustrated, but I didn't—" She stopped. "I didn't think losing a deal was something someone went that far over. People build their business identity around certain wins. When those get taken repeatedly, it stops being business. It becomes personal." She looked at her hands on the desk. "I've made it personal too, with competitors. I've been aggressive in ways that I told myself were just competitive, and She pressed her lips together. "I don't know what I'm saying exactly. You're saying that winning the way you've been winning has costs you're just now accounting for." She looked up. "That sounds like a criticism." "It's an observation. You can do something with it or not." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Fitch upgraded the access control system this week. The contractor finished the camera coverage in the dead zones this morning. You've restructured the overnight protocols and briefed the team on the new shift transition procedures." She paused. "Marcus is being promoted to chief of staff, which I announced this morning, and I had the conversation with Dana yesterday afternoon." "How did that go?" She cried a little. "So did I, which I wasn't expecting." A pause that had something in it that wasn't quite embarrassment, more like the slight surprise of someone discovering they're capable of something they hadn't tested. "She didn't know that I'd noticed. She'd been here for 6 years, and she thought—" Celeste stopped. "She thought she was invisible to me." He didn't say anything. "How many other people in this building feel like that?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Enough that it's worth finding out." "How do I find out?" "Ask them. Not in a corporate survey format that goes to HR and produces a report. Just ask them." He paused. "Start with the people who've been here the longest and who you know the least about. They'll tell you things if you actually want to hear it." She looked at him across the desk for a moment. Outside the windows, the city was doing what it did in late afternoon on a clear day. The particular quality of light that turned the glass buildings into something almost warm, almost golden, a lie the city told daily about its own character that was somehow still convincing. "I'd like to do something," she said carefully. "For the building, for the staff. Not a bonus or a benefit. Those are transactional. Something that says," she paused, "I don't know what it says exactly. That you see them." "Yes." A pause. "That I see them." "Then start there. Start with seeing them. Everything else follows from that." She picked up a pen, set it down, picked it up again. "Paul Okereke. He comes back next week. Monday. I want to talk to him before he comes back to his post. Not a formal meeting. I want to go to him, wherever he's comfortable." Nolan looked at her. "His wife will probably bake something. Then I'll eat it." A beat. Is that the right instinct? Or am I... It's the right instinct. You didn't let me finish. You were going to second guess it. Don't. He stood. Call him tonight. Keep it short. Just say you're glad he's coming back and ask if you can see him. She nodded. Something in the nod was more human than the professional composure she'd been wearing since he'd walked in. The specific expression of a person who is trying to do something right and isn't entirely sure of their footing and knows it. It was, he thought, a better expression than the certainty he'd seen on her face for 11 months. Certainty was comfortable. This was better. The press coverage of the Callaway principal's arrest ran on a Friday and was significant. Front page of the business section, 2 cable news cycles, the kind of story that had enough elements to hold attention for a full week. Wealthy competitor hires professional crew to abduct rival. Failed intervention by terminated employee who turned out to be ex-Navy SEAL. The narrative practically constructed itself, and several journalists had clearly put effort into finding people willing to comment on Nolan's background. He didn't read most of it. His mother read all of it and called him on Saturday morning to deliver her assessment of each article's accuracy, which he received with the patience of a man who understood that some forces were beyond the scope of his training. Dylan read it too, or had it read to him from the school newspaper that had apparently devoted a paragraph to a local Navy veteran's act of bravery because one of his classmates had found the story and shared it, and his teacher, a thoughtful woman named Ms. Albrecht, had used it as a current events discussion before realizing that the Navy veteran in question might be a particular student's father, and then navigating that realization with the professional agility of someone who had managed classroom moments for 20 years. Dylan had come home that afternoon with the measured expression of a person processing a thing that is simultaneously about someone they know and also bigger than the person they know. "Your picture was in a real newspaper," he said at dinner. "A small part of the newspaper. The business section, mostly. Still real." Dylan ate for a moment. "Ms. Albrecht said you were brave." "Ms. Albrecht is very kind." She said brave, not kind. He looked up. "Are you brave?" Nolan considered the question the way Dylan had delivered it. Seriously, as a genuine inquiry rather than a rhetorical one. "I'm trained," he said finally. "I've spent a long time learning how to do specific things in specific situations. When those situations happened, I did the things I was trained to do." "That's not the same as brave?" "Brave is when you're scared and you do the thing anyway. I'm not usually scared in those situations, so I don't know if what I do counts as brave exactly." Dylan turned this over. "What are you scared of?" "Being late, missing things, not being here when you need me." His son looked at him for a long moment with the clear-eyed intensity that children bring to things they find important. Then he picked up his fork again. "You're always here," he said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating a thing they have verified repeatedly and found reliable. Nolan looked at his son. The kitchen was warm. The noodles were hot this time. Actually hot. Not eaten standing up at a counter after a complicated Tuesday, but sitting at the table at a reasonable hour with the specific ordinary quality of an evening that didn't require anything except being present in it. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Dylan nodded, satisfied, and ate his dinner. Later, after Dylan was in bed and the apartment was quiet, Nolan sat at the kitchen table with the last of his coffee and his notebook, and he worked through the remaining items on his list. Access log review? Completed. Camera coverage? Completed. Shift protocol briefing completed. Follow up with Vera on the DA's timeline, scheduled for Monday. Visit to Paul Okereke, Monday as well. He came to the bottom of the page. He'd been keeping these lists since the Navy, the habit of writing things down not because he'd forget them, but because writing them down moved them from the space in his head where they occupied anxious real estate into the space on the page where they became manageable tasks. It was a small system, and it worked. At the bottom of the page, he wrote two things that weren't tasks exactly, more like observations. The kind of thing he occasionally wrote when the day had contained something worth recording. People see what they're looking for. And below that, after a pause, change what you're looking for. He looked at it for a moment, then he closed the notebook, rinsed his coffee cup, and turned off the kitchen light. The picture frame on the counter caught the light from the hallway before the apartment went dark. Dylan in the red cap, mid-laugh, the moment fully alive in the way photographs hold moments when the person they contain doesn't know they're being held. Nolan went to bed at a reasonable hour, which was, in its own way, everything he'd been working toward. Paula Kariki's house was a 40-minute drive from the Ashford Group's headquarters, out past the eastern edge of the city where the density thinned and the streets widened and the houses had actual yards with actual grass that people apparently maintained because they wanted to rather than because a homeowners association required it. It was the kind of neighborhood that didn't make it into anyone's description of the city but contained most of the city's actual life. The part where people went home after work and cooked dinner and argued about small things and fixed what broke when they could afford to and let it stay broken when they couldn't. Nolan drove. Celeste sat in the passenger seat, which was new. The first time in the weeks since his return that she'd sat anywhere other than the back, and she'd gotten in the front without discussion or announcement. Just opened the passenger door and sat down in the way that people do when they've made a decision about something and don't feel the need to explain it. He hadn't commented on it. She was looking out the window as they left the downtown corridor behind, watching the city change its character block by block. She had a folder on her lap, something Marcus had prepared, background on Paul's employment record, his tenure, his performance reviews, but she hadn't opened it. She'd been carrying it since the elevator, and it had stayed closed the whole ride. "I'm nervous," she said. She said it like a person identifying a fact about themselves that they find mildly inconvenient. "I know. I don't get nervous about meetings." "This isn't a meeting." She turned the folder over in her hands. "What is it?" "It's an apology. People get nervous about those." He checked the mirror, took a left. "It means you're taking it seriously." "What if he doesn't—" She stopped. "What if he doesn't what? What if he doesn't want the apology? What if he's angry and the right thing is to let him be angry and I—" She pressed her lips together. "I'm not good at being the person someone's angry at. I'm used to being the person who decides when a conversation's over." Nolan drove for a moment without answering. The street they were on had a row of maples down the median, not yet fully into their fall color but starting, the edges of the leaves catching first, the green retreating from the outside in. "Let him be whatever he is," he said finally. "You're not going there to manage the outcome. You're going there to show up." She absorbed this. That's deceptively simple. Most true things are. She looked at the folder in her hands and then set it on the back seat, which he thought was probably the right decision. Paul's wife answered the door. Her name was Adaiz. Warm, direct, 5 months pregnant with their second child in a way that she carried with the matter-of-fact competence of someone whose body had done this before and knew what it was doing. She looked at Nolan first, and the look she gave him was the same one his mother sometimes gave him. The look that said, "I have information about what you did, and I have decided what I think about it." And then she looked at Celeste with the careful assessment of a woman who had heard about Celeste Ashford through her husband's employment and through 3 weeks of news coverage and had formed opinions on both bases. "Come in," she said. Her voice was warm but not unconditional. Paul was in the living room in an armchair, a position that Nolan suspected had been the site of considerable recuperation over the past 3 weeks. There was the specific worn quality of a piece of furniture that has been occupied by someone recovering, surrounded by the small ecosystem of that recovery. A side table with medication, a water glass, a television remote. He was upright and dressed, which meant he'd made an effort. His head was still bandaged, but the bandage was smaller now. the kind that comes later in healing rather than earlier. He looked at Nolan first, too. "You look exactly like the news photo," he said. "I expected you to look different in person." The photo was bad. It was accurate. He turned to Celeste. Something in his expression wasn't hostile, but it was careful, the caution of a man who had been carrying something he hadn't yet decided what to do with. "Ms. Ashford." "Paul." She stopped a few feet inside the room, didn't immediately move to sit, didn't fill the space with professional ease. She just stood there, which took a certain kind of effort that Nolan recognized. "Thank you for letting me come." "Ariez thought it was important," Paul said. Then, after a brief pause, "I did too. Eventually." Adieze gestured Nolan toward the couch with the authority of a person managing traffic in their own home, and he sat. She disappeared toward the kitchen, and the sounds that followed, specific, domestic, familiar, were the sounds of a household doing what households do to manage difficult conversations by giving everyone something concrete to focus on. She'd said she was going to bring coffee, and she'd said it in the tone that meant the coffee was already made and its arrival was not a question. Celeste sat in the chair across from Paul. The room was quiet for a moment. "How's your head?" she said. "Better than 3 weeks ago." A pause. "Still gets loud when it's been a long day." "I'm sorry." He looked at her. "For the head or for all of it?" She said it flat and direct, no orchestration. "For the security review that flagged the shift change gap 14 months ago and didn't get the resources it needed. For the fact that the building you came to work in wasn't as safe as it should have been. For..." She stopped briefly. "I had a conversation with Gerald Fitch about the review, about what happened to it, and I've been sitting with the fact that the decision to deprioritize it was mine. Even if it went through a VP, the budget authority was mine." Paul was watching her with the full attention of someone who is measuring each word against what they already know and deciding how much weight to give it. "The other man," Paul said carefully, "the one who hired the crew, being prosecuted. The DA's office is confident. I've been following the news." He shifted slightly in the chair. "I've been following it, and every day I wake up and my head hurts and my wife is pregnant, and I keep thinking, somebody decided that a business deal was worth this." He gestured at himself, at the bandage, at the chair he was sitting in. "Worth my being here instead of at work. Worth whatever my wife has been carrying for 3 weeks." "Yes," Celeste said. "Somebody did. And you didn't know. I know you didn't know. I've had time to think about that." He paused. "But the reason someone thought you were worth targeting was because of how you compete, how hard you go after what you want." She held his gaze. "I know. I'm not saying that to blame you. I understand. I'm saying it because..." He stopped, reformulated. "I've worked security for 15 years. I've worked for 6 different organizations. And in all of that time, the thing that made buildings safe or unsafe wasn't the equipment. It wasn't the protocols. It was whether the person at the top considered the people at the bottom part of the thing worth protecting." He paused. "Not everybody does." The room was quiet. Adiez appeared in the doorway with a tray, coffee, and something wrapped in foil that turned out to be chin-chin, the small fried dough pieces that had been cooling since that morning, and set it on the table between them with the efficiency of someone who has made her contribution to this conversation and is now going to let it happen. Celeste looked at Paul. "Are you asking me whether I do?" "I'm asking you what you're going to do differently." It was a direct question delivered without aggression, the kind that requires a direct answer or exposes itself as a deflection. Celeste put both hands around her coffee cup, the same way Nolan's mother held hers, he noticed, the gesture of a person who needs something to hold while they're saying something real. And she answered. She told him about the access control upgrade and the camera dead zones and the shift protocol restructuring. She told him about Fitch and the review and the budget authorization she'd given retroactively for every security recommendation that had been deprioritized in the past 3 years. She told him about Dana and Marcus and the conversation she'd been having on the floors she used to move through without stopping. And then she told him the thing she hadn't told anyone except Nolan, the thing she'd been working toward in the 3 weeks since the lobby, that she was planning to formalize a company-wide standard that wasn't about security protocols at all, but about how people were treated, Not a policy document, not an HR initiative with a name and a committee. A standard. The same standard held from the 42nd floor to the loading dock. The same respect, the same visibility, the same weight given to the person who cleans the executive bathroom and the person who occupies it. Paul listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt and he didn't nod along performatively. He just listened, the way a person listens when they're trying to determine if something is true. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Did he tell you to say that? He looked at Nolan. No, Celeste said. He told me to tell you the truth. This is the truth. Paul looked at Nolan anyway, the sideways look of a man checking a reference. Nolan met it without comment, which was apparently sufficient, because Paul turned back to Celeste and something in his posture shifted. Small, not dramatic. The particular settling of a person who has been holding a position for a long time and has just decided they can set it down. All right, he said. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, or not only that. It was something more like an agreement to move forward, which is what most actual resolutions are. Not the clean completion of a story, but the decision to keep going with the next part of it. Adeyeze, from the doorway, said, "Eat the chin-chin, child." On the drive back, Celeste was quiet for a long time. Not the managed quiet of a person organizing their presentation, but the actual quiet of someone who has been through something and is letting it settle. They were 20 minutes from the city when she said, "The standard I talked about, I want to make it real." I know. Not a document, not an announcement with a logo. She was looking at the road ahead, not at him. Something that actually changes how the organization operates, how people are brought in, how they're developed, how decisions get made about who matters. That's harder than the document. I know it's harder. That's why I need it to be harder. She paused. I've been thinking about what Paul said, about whether the person at the top considers the people at the bottom part of the thing worth protecting. She turned slightly. I've been running this company for 7 years, and I can tell you every asset we own and its current valuation and its acquisition history. I cannot tell you the names of half the people who maintain those assets every day. That's fixable? It's fixable, and it's embarrassing that it needs fixing. A pause. I want your help. Not as security director. That's not the right frame for this. Just, she paused, looking for the right word and not quite landing on it. As the person who's been watching, he said. Yes, as the person who's been watching. He thought about it. Start with one floor. Not the executive level. Start in the middle. Operations, facilities, the people who coordinate the daily function of the building. Have a meeting that has no agenda except for them to tell you what their day actually looks like. Don't bring Marcus, don't bring HR. Just you. And you? And me. She nodded. When? Next week. Give me 2 days to set it up so it doesn't feel like a performance. How do you make it not feel like a performance? By not performing. He glanced at her briefly. You're better at that than you think. This afternoon proved it. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, something in her voice had the quality that appeared occasionally now, the slight roughness of someone speaking from a place slightly less defended than usual. I keep thinking about what I almost lost. Not my life, though that too, but what I almost made happen. If you hadn't come back, if Paul had... She stopped. If the outcome had been different, I'd have been sitting in a different building, running the same company the same way, and people who trusted the building to be safe would have paid for that. But that's not what happened. No, but I was always one bad Tuesday away from it, before anything changed. She paused. That's not a comfortable thing to understand about yourself. No, he said, it's not. But uncomfortable understanding is usually the only kind that actually does anything. She turned to look at him. Where did you develop the habit of saying things that are true and slightly annoying at the same time? Navy. It's effective. I know. She almost smiled. The city appeared on the horizon, the skyline coming back into view as they crested the overpass, the buildings catching the late afternoon the way they always did this time of day, making the same daily lie about warmth and permanence. Nolan had driven this approach into the city hundreds of times, and it still caught him occasionally, the way the light hit the glass and made something industrial look briefly like something worth hoping for. The meeting on the 14th floor happened on a Thursday, 10 days later. Nolan had spent those 10 days talking to people. The quiet, unscheduled kind of conversations that happen when a person with a security credential moves through a building without apparent urgency and asks genuine questions. He'd talked to the operations coordinator who'd worked for the Ashford Group for 9 years and had never had a direct conversation with Celeste. He'd talked to the 2 facilities managers who shared a windowless office on the 14th floor and who had between them 17 years of institutional knowledge about every system in the building. He'd talked to the 3 women who ran the invoice processing function, who had noticed over the preceding weeks that someone had started returning their good morning greetings in the elevator in a way that hadn't happened before. He hadn't promised anyone anything. He just listened, and what he'd collected was not a list of grievances, though there were grievances, legitimate ones, but a picture of an organization that was more capable than its top floor knew, staffed by people who had been doing good work in the specific kind of invisibility that comes from being competent in a place where competence is taken for granted. The meeting was in the 14th floor conference room, which nobody had used for a meeting with executive attendance in 3 years. Nolan had made sure the room was set up plainly. No catering, no presentation screen, just a table and chairs and a notepad at every seat, because people tend to be more honest when they have something to do with their hands. 12 people came. Operations, facilities, the invoice team, 2 building engineers, and a woman named Rosa, who had been the Ashford Group's head of vendor relations for 11 years, and who had been introduced to Celeste exactly twice in that time, both times in passing. Celeste came in without Marcus, without her tablet, without the blazer she usually wore as a kind of armor. She wore a different jacket, still professional, but with the specific quality of something chosen for comfort rather than projection. And she sat down at the table in the middle of the group rather than at the head of it, which Nolan had suggested, and which she had done without argument. She started by saying, "I want to understand what your work actually is, not what the org chart says, what it actually is every day, and what gets in the way of doing it well." The room was quiet for a moment, the particular careful quiet of people trying to determine whether this was real or whether it was the kind of listening that wants to hear specific things and reacts badly to anything else. Rosa, who had 11 years of patience and apparently a finite supply of it, spoke first. The vendor approval process takes 3 weeks for anything over $10,000. Half of that time is waiting for a signature from someone who doesn't look at their email. She said it without hostility, just the flat delivery of a person stating a documented fact. Celeste said, "Whose signature?" Rosa named the VP. Celeste wrote it down. "I'll fix that this week." What else? What followed was 2 hours that Nolan had expected to be awkward and turned out to be something else entirely. Something closer to the productive tension of a room full of people who have information that needs to be in the room and have just been told that it's allowed to be there. People talked over each other occasionally, apologized, backed up. Someone made a joke about the coffee machine on the 14th floor that had been broken for 4 months, and everyone laughed in the way people laugh at things that are funny because they're also actually true. Celeste didn't perform listening. She asked follow-up questions that were specific and relevant, the kind that demonstrate that you heard what someone said rather than what you expected them to say. She wrote things down. When she didn't know something, she said so. 3 times. In the space of 2 hours. She said, "I don't know," or "I didn't realize," that with the directness of someone who had stopped treating not knowing as a vulnerability. At the end of it, one of the building engineers, a quiet man named Terrence, who had said almost nothing for the first 90 minutes, leaned forward and said, "Can I ask something?" "Of course," Celeste said. Is this going to happen again? Like, not this meeting specifically, but are we going to be asked what we think again at some point?" The room was quiet. Everyone waiting. "Yes," Celeste said. "This is the first one, not the only one." Terrence nodded slowly, the nod of a man who was filing that away to verify over time, which was, Nolan thought, the exactly correct response. Trust is verified, not granted. You say what you're going to do and then you do it, and the trust comes from the pattern, not the statement. After the meeting, when the room had cleared and it was just the 2 of them gathering the notepads, Celeste said, "Rosa has been here 11 years. Yes. She knows every vendor relationship this company has, She's managed contract negotiations I didn't even know were happening. She paused. I've met her twice. You've met her 3 times now. She looked at him. Something in her expression had the quality it sometimes got now. The particular look of a person who has seen something clearly that they've been looking at for a long time without seeing. 3 times in 11 years is not substantially better than twice. No, but it's the beginning of better. She picked up the notepad. The vendor approval process, the broken coffee machine, 6 other items that all had owners and timelines now because she'd written them down with the intention of following through rather than processing and filing. I'm going to be bad at this for a while, she said. At this version of running the company. I've been doing the other version for 7 years, and this is different, and I'm going to make mistakes in it. You will, he agreed. You're not supposed to argue with that. I'm not arguing. I'm confirming. He set the last notepad down. The mistakes are fine. The thing that matters is what you do after them. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her jacket from the back of the chair and said, Lunch. The place on 5th that you drive past every morning and never stop at. He raised an eyebrow. You look at it every time we pass. I've noticed. It's a reasonable observation. It's a good restaurant. I've eaten there twice. She moved toward the door. You've been telling me what to do for 6 weeks. Let me buy you lunch. He thought about the appropriate professional response and then thought about the fact that the appropriate professional response was exactly the kind of distance he'd been working in his own quiet way to help close. All right, he said, but I'm driving. Obviously. 6 months passed. They passed the way months do when the work is real and the days are full. Not smoothly, not without friction, but with the specific forward momentum of things being built rather than just maintained. The Ashford Group's security infrastructure was comprehensively upgraded, the vulnerabilities addressed, the protocols restructured in ways that Fitch, with visible satisfaction, described to the building staff at a quarterly briefing with the confidence of a man who had been right about things for a long time and was glad to finally be in the room where that mattered. Paul Okereke came back on a Monday in November, which he had requested specifically because Mondays were how you told your nervous system that a thing was over and a new thing had started. He returned to a post that had been redesigned, not diminished, redesigned, with clearer protocols and better equipment and the kind of operational backing that made a person feel like what they did was considered important rather than just necessary. On his first day back, he and Nolan walked the lobby together for 20 minutes, going over the new procedures. And at the end of it, Paul had looked at the rebuilt waterfall feature. Fully operational again, the cracked tile replaced, the surrounding area slightly different in its material because an exact match hadn't been available, and Fitch had chosen something complementary rather than pretending, and said, "It looks better." "Different," Nolan said. "Yeah." Paul considered the water moving over the new stone. Different isn't bad. Adeze had their second child in December. A girl, which Paul had apparently predicted with sufficient confidence to have already ordered the specific shade of paint for the nursery. He texted Nolan a photo from the hospital. The baby asleep on Adeze's chest with the compressed, slightly baffled expression of a person who has very recently arrived somewhere and has not yet formed opinions about it. The text below the photo said, "Her name is Celeste, Adeze's idea. I told her that was going to be confusing at the office, and she said, then you can explain why, which is correct." Nolan showed Celeste Ashford the photo the following Monday. She looked at it for a long moment and then handed the phone back without a word. But her expression was the one she'd been showing more frequently since November. The one that didn't have a professional category, that lived in the part of a person that their job title doesn't cover. "Tell him congratulations," she said. "Tell him yourself." She looked at him. "He works 4 floors below you," Nolan said. "Tell him yourself." She did. He knew because Paul texted him that afternoon. "She came down here. She brought flowers. Real ones, not the kind from a lobby gift shop. I don't know what you did to her, but I think it's going to be okay." Nolan texted back. "I didn't do anything to her. She did it herself." He paused, then added, "Most of it." Dylan turned 7 in February. The party was at Margaret's house, which had the practical advantage of more yard space and the further advantage of Margaret's opinion that birthday parties required 3 times the food that any reasonable assessment would suggest, which meant there was enough for everyone including the 4 kids who arrived without RSVPs. because they'd heard about the cake. Dylan had requested a baseball theme, which Nolan had executed with the specific focus he brought to tasks that mattered. Real pennants, not the plastic kind, proper mitts for the catch game in the yard, a cake with an actual baseball stitching pattern that the bakery had initially suggested was complicated, and that Margaret had responded to with the expression she used when she had decided something was going to happen and was waiting for the relevant parties to catch up. Nolan stood at the edge of the yard in the February cold, watching Dylan run a modified bases game with 4 other 7-year-olds who were using rules they had apparently invented on the spot, and he thought about a Tuesday evening in October. The rain, the parking meter, the picture frame set against the base of the meter, while he went back through a side door into a situation that could have ended differently. He thought about it the way he sometimes did, not with drama, but with the particular clarity that certain moments have when you look at them from enough distance. The things that had shifted in the months since. Fitch's satisfaction. Paul's daughter. The 14th floor conference room and Rosa's 11 years finally being in the room. Dylan drawing cars with flags at his grandmother's kitchen table. The things that hadn't shifted or hadn't shifted yet, or maybe never would, because not everything resolves, and not everything should, because some things are ongoing, and ongoing isn't a failure state, it's just the actual texture of a life. Margaret appeared beside him with a jacket she'd brought from inside, because she had decided he was cold whether or not he believed it, and he put it on without argument, which she received with the expression of a woman who has been winning this particular battle for 37 years. She called again, Margaret said. Not accusatory, just informational. Nolan looked at her. When? Yesterday. She calls the house when she can't reach you directly, which happens about once a week. A pause. She called to ask if Dylan had a favorite player. He looked back at the yard. Dylan had just argued successfully for a do-over in a way that had the other 4 children nodding in acknowledgement of his point, which suggested either a natural gift for debate or a capacity for compelling narrative, both of which seemed equally likely given the source material. He bought him a jersey, Margaret said, for his birthday. She dropped it off yesterday. She didn't want to come to the party uninvited. She said that to me directly, that she didn't want to presume. Nolan looked at his mother. She said that. She did. A pause. She's changed, that woman. I watched the news in October and I watched it in November, and I've talked to her 3 times on the phone in the months since, and she has changed in a way that's real. Margaret's voice had the quality it got when she was delivering a verdict she'd been deliberating on. It's not finished. She'll backslide. Probably already has a few times and will again, but it's real. I know, he said. You knew before I did. I hoped before you did. It's different. Margaret looked at him sideways. Are you happy? He thought about the question the way he thought about things that deserved actual consideration rather than reflex. The apartment. Dylan's bedroom, more fully furnished than his own. The narrow notebook on the kitchen table. The picture frame on the counter. The morning drives through the city. The building that was different now in ways that the building itself couldn't articulate, but that the people inside it could. The work that felt like work rather than performance. Yeah, he said. I think so. You think so? I'm not prone to certainty about internal states. You know this about me. I do. She looked at the yard. Dylan had scored something. It was unclear what, given the invented rules, and was doing a small celebratory run that had no athletic logic but significant personal expression. You're a good father, Nolan. He didn't say anything. Some things landed differently when they came from certain people, and this was one of them. Your father would have liked this, she said. He would have liked who you became. She paused. He'd have been insufferable about it. He'd have told every person he met about your Navy record and made you repeat the lobby story approximately 400 times, but underneath all that insufferableness, he would have been so proud of you. Nolan looked at the yard, the cold air. Dylan running the bases that were actually 4 chairs arranged in a rough diamond because the rules had apparently evolved again while he wasn't watching. I know, he said, and he did. That evening, after the party, After the children had been collected and the yard cleaned and the leftover cake divided into portions that Margaret had wrapped with the precision of a woman who has been wrapping cake portions for decades, Nolan drove home through the city with Dylan asleep in the back seat. The jersey was in Dylan's lap. He'd put it on over his shirt at the party and refused to take it off for the rest of the afternoon, and he'd fallen asleep with his hands resting on the fabric in the easy way that children hold things they like. The city at 9 on a February night was different from the city in October rush hour. Quieter, the streets opening up, the lights warmer in the cold air, the particular quality of a city that has done its daily work and is now simply existing. Nolan drove it the way he always drove. Attentive, not rushed, with the automatic awareness of someone who has logged enough hours behind a wheel to do it without thinking about it and chooses to think about it anyway. He thought about the question his mother had asked, about happiness, which was a thing he'd always had a complicated relationship with. Not because he was against it, but because it had always seemed like something that arrived at the end of things, the conclusion of a story, the reward at the finish line. He'd spent a long time waiting for the version of his life that would feel finished enough to be happy in. He was starting to understand that finished wasn't the frame, that what he'd been building, slowly, imperfectly, in the space between Tuesday evenings and noodle dinners and narrow notebooks and a parking meter on Callaway Street, wasn't a version of life he was moving toward, but one he was already in. That the life worth having wasn't the one that looked right from the outside or tied itself into a clean narrative, but the one that contained actual people actually mattering to each other in the specific small ways that don't make it into anyone's news coverage. Paul's daughter sleeping in a hospital, Rosa's 11 years finally in the room, Fitch walking a security briefing with the confidence of someone whose work had been acknowledged, Dylan drawing cars in his grandmother's kitchen, waiting without saying he was waiting. None of it was a story with a beginning, middle, and end. It was just a life. His life. And in the back seat, Dylan shifted in his sleep and made a small sound and settled again, hands still resting on the jersey, and Nolan drove through the February city toward their apartment and the kitchen counter where a picture frame sat against the backsplash, and the narrow notebook with its accumulated list of things done and still to do, and the ordinary ongoing work of being a person who showed up, which was, he had come to understand, not the least of what a person could be. It was in fact nearly everything.